Hello and welcome to the channel Windows vs Linux. This will be the last video in the mini-series of how we can try to get Windows software to run within Linux or alongside Linux. In the first video I talked about how to use the program in Linux called Wine to try to get Windows programs to work natively within Linux. Then we discussed how to set up and run a virtual machine in order to run Windows within Linux itself. And in this video we're going to be talking about how to dual boot Windows with Linux. So I have said in one of the previous videos that this is pretty much your last resort. This is not the preferred option to do this. And the reason for that is because if you run any other operating system alongside Windows, Windows updates tend to be a little malicious. And if it sees Linux is installed, it may blow out Linux and you'll completely be unable to boot with it into the Linux portion of your system. So that's just a chance that you take with this option. There are people that have dual booted for years without issue, but there are people that within the first week a Windows update will come along and then they can no longer dual boot. They just have Windows available. So that is the downside to this. The upside is as previously with virtual machines, you had to split your computer's resources in order to run the host machine and then the virtual machine that you were running Windows with. With dual booting, you just choose whichever operating system you want to boot to, and your entire system's resources, so your memory, your processor speed, all of that is dedicated to that one operating system. So you're not having to split things. So as I said, dual booting allows you to run multiple operating systems on one hard drive. So you can have Linux for your day-to-day usage, or you can have Windows if you ever need to run things like Photoshop, Microsoft Office, things like that. I will say that it is much, much easier to install Linux on top of Windows rather than the other way around. So I would highly advise you to install Windows first and then put Linux on top of that, because it's much simpler to do it that way. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump into the Linux live environment, and that is one thing I will note. You will have to have Linux, any version that you want, but for this case I'm going to be showing Linux Mint. You will want to have Linux Mint loaded onto a USB drive, and then we're going to boot into the live environment of Linux, which I showed you in a previous video. And then from there, I'll show you the process to install that alongside Windows. So we'll go ahead and jump into Linux live environment and we'll get started. Okay, so here we are within the live environment of Linux Mint. You can tell this is the live environment because we do see the install Linux Mint icon right here. So we'll go ahead and click on this. And do bear in mind that this machine that this is running on does have Windows 10 already installed. So English is fine. We're going to hit continue. Keyboard layout is English, that's fine. Pretty much if you were installing Linux Mint normally, this process is completely identical except for one step. So we will go ahead and install third-party software. Let that take a second. Okay, so when you reach this point, this is pretty much the only step that is different from a normal Linux Mint install, and it's already checked on what we want. Linux Mint already has determined that we have Windows 10 installed. It immediately picks up on that, so it's going to offer us to install Linux Mint alongside Windows 10. And if you read the bottom, all of your personal files will be kept, and you can choose which operating system you want to boot into essentially each time the computer starts up. So that is what we want checked. We'll hit continue. And here it's asking us where we want to install Linux Mint. Now, if you had multiple hard drives, you could actually choose another hard drive from this drop-down list. But since we only have one hard drive installed, it's only going to offer us this one. Now, like I said in the previous video, if you do have multiple hard drives, I would highly, highly, highly recommend installing Linux Mint on a different hard drive than Windows, because then you will never encounter that Windows Update issue. If Windows updates, it'll just update to that hard drive and leave Linux Mint untouched on the other hard drive. But as I said, in this video we only have the one hard drive, so that's the one with its selects. And this on the left here where it says Files, this is your Windows, and on the right is Linux Mint. Now you can choose how much space you want to give Linux Mint and Windows, and all you have to do is click this bar in the middle and just drag. So if we want less space allocated for Mint, we just drag it more towards there. If we want Linux Mint to take up more space, we drag it the opposite way. So I would say for dual booting, if you're using Windows for a lot of high-end stuff like games, a lot of really heavy-duty programs, I would definitely say to give Windows more space than Linux. But if you're just using Windows for a couple programs here and there that you don't use that often, definitely give Linux Mint more space, because that's pretty much whatever one you'll be using the most, give that one the more space, essentially. So this looks fine for me. I'll just go ahead and hit install now. It's going to confirm what you're doing. You cannot undo this operation, so make sure that you have this set. And it may prompt us one more time. Yep, so it's basically having you double confirm what you're going to be doing here. And then I believe from here on out, it's pretty much identical to a normal Linux Mint install. It's going to ask our time zone. Chicago is fine for me. Okay, it's going to have you create a user. So again, I will just do my normal. And I will require the password on login. And it is off. So I'll let this install and I'll see you back in a bit. Okay, so our installation is complete. And before I restart, I'm going to move the camera behind the computer so you can actually see what happens when you restart the machine. So I'll see you in a bit. Okay, so we are ready to restart. So we're going to hit restart now. And from once it restarts, you can go ahead and pull out the flash drive that you had Linux Mint on, and it'll even tell you there, please remove installation media and press enter. And once it restarts, we should see a screen. Yes, that screen there. So hopefully you can see this. I will try to zoom in a bit. Okay, so if you could see that, I'll restart it again so you can actually see it. What it does, if you don't press anything, it will automatically default to whatever the top version was, which was Linux. So if I power off and power that back on again, you'll see at the very top it'll say Linux Mint Cinnamon, which is the version of Linux Mint that we're running. Okay, and then if we scroll down a bit, at the very bottom you'll see Windows 10 right there. So if I press that instead, you can see it is now booting into Windows. And there we go. So that is how you dual boot Linux Mint with Windows 10. Again, this is really good if you need to run any kind of specific Windows 10 software or Windows software in general. But like I said, this would be your last option. I would definitely go through the first two options first, and if you just can't get it working with that, then you could go to this option. So definitely check that out. In the next coming videos, I'll be showing some more comparisons between how to do different things between Linux and Windows. So stay tuned for those videos. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you then. Thank you very much.